Whatever the contradictions in some of these cases, when new technologies are embraced as potentially powerful forms of collective self-production, they enable Indigenous cultural activists to assert their presence in the polities that encompass them and to more easily enter into much larger movements for social transformation, for the recognition and redress of human and cultural rights, and to enter into processes in which media can play an increasingly important role in advancing their agendas on the world stage. Another point we could discuss in Q&A, but the kinds of film festivals and other activities that bring people together worldwide have actually played a very important role in developing very strong transnational connections with different groups. Perhaps the most articulate theorization of Indigenous media has come from the work of the late Maori filmmaker and intellectual Barry Barclay, who coined the term fourth cinema in his book Our Own Image, published in 1990. In that publication, and in almost all his writing until his death in 2008, Barclay argued for Indigenous filmmaking as a hui, the term for a Maori gathering or meeting, drawing on the power of community on and off screen. In keeping with his developing ideas about fourth cinema, Barclay saw all of his feature films as comprising multiple elements, from the pre-production consultation with the communities to be filmed, to the actual detail of the shooting, and on to the questions of distribution, reception, and film use, and who should be involved in profits. He emphasized koreo, or protocols, to ensure that the end product was appropriately returned to those who had given to it, as part of his notion of what he termed total filmmaking, an inclusive process of discussion and advice. As Barclay and others have suggested, Indigenous media worldwide represents a countercurrent to neoliberal trends that seek to deracinate and commodify culture. Often working against the grain of late capitalist economies, they seek to circulate their work via embedded notions of reciprocity, cultural rights, and all based on the need for communities to maintain guardianship over their cultural property. Over the last 3 decades, well, didn't need that part. Television has spread from centers to peripheries, part of the rapidly changing landscape of global television, what some have called planet TV. As media technology has expanded from the historical form of terrestrial TV to the more flexible range of satellite and small format video, and increasingly convergence with the internet. The localized possibilities in this form of globalization are especially apparent in the uptake of such media forms in First Peoples communities throughout the world, creating, as Canadian scholar Lorna Roth has written, something new in the air to describe the evolution of Inuit television in the Arctic. The capacity of such media to communicate the concerns of Indigenous people to many audiences has created, some argue, a discursive space for an emergent Indigenous public sphere, while the most pessimistic suggest that these projects inevitably entail a corrupt relationship that involves getting into bed with the state or commercial interests. These concerns about compromise continue to haunt much of the research and debate on Indigenous television, echoing the suspicions of Indigenous communities as they have struggled to imagine how they might turn the imposition of media technologies to their advantage. Generally, this has involved a recognition of the cultural possibilities of indigenously controlled media making as a way of rendering the nations that encompass them more aware of Indigenous concerns, while also strengthening local, intergenerational, and inter-community knowledge. When they can control the circumstances of production and circulation, Indigenous activists have embraced television and other media recognized as potentially important assets, as technologies that have allowed them some degree of agency, albeit often within hegemonic forms of representation and often under less than ideal conditions. To some extent, Indigenous concerns about compromise benefited from the fact that many of the communication technologies they had wanted to use initially were regarded as experimental and marginal. Indeed, because the very idea of Indigenous television was regarded as somewhat of an oxymoron in its early days, it often allowed this work to unfold kind of under the radar at its own pace, in line with indigenously based ideas of what constitutes appropriate production and circulation practices, as well as aesthetics. So, for example, in the case of Central Australia, an appropriate video could only be made if the proper and appropriate kin were there to guarantee that ceremony or other activities being videotaped were properly carried out. So there was like an off-screen presence that would guarantee that it was being done properly. Following on the heels of broader movements for Indigenous rights, activists in a number of locales have pushed government bodies to allocate resources for their communities to produce and circulate representations of themselves, their histories, and their worldviews, and this is particularly in the former British Commonwealths of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where there's still a kind of remnant of a welfare state that will provide resources for such things. Of particular concern is the capacity to create programming for all age groups in their local languages to combat the overwhelming effects of exposure to the dominant culture and the dominant language through other forms of television, a debate that's been active in the 1970s and resurfaced in 2005 regarding language policy on Canada's APTN and New Zealand's Maori TV. Eventually, the appropriation of television was recognized as an important technology in the development of Indigenous citizenship for those living in both remote and urban areas. Importantly, these developments have also served as incubators of Indigenous talent of all sorts, as Indigenous producers, directors, actors, writers, and editors have had opportunities made available to them that never before existed. Increasingly, Indigenous work from different parts of the world is a regular part of programming for these television stations. Just as a case in point, the director of Samson and Delilah that won the Palme d'Or at Cannes Film Festival, when he won the award at Cannes Film Festival, got up and said, they asked him to make some comments, and he said, well, filmmaking saved my life, he said, because most of the young men growing up in Central Australia who resembled him, he said, are dead by now. And he said picking up the camera and being able to make movies expressive of his own experiences and those in the world around him really gave him a kind of purpose that he hadn't had before, and he also was very really enormously talented. So the power of this kind of work for a certain generation, I think, is not to be discounted. Scholars and researchers have been attracted to Indigenous television since the mid-1980s, seeking in it the empirical evidence of a kind of embedded cultural critique, an aesthetic and political alternative to mass media, although alternative to the mass media that is beholden to government or late capitalist interests. This sense of possibility was first articulated in the mid-80s in the example I gave you of the work at Yundamu, which showed the complex epistemology surrounding image production in traditional Aboriginal life, the significance of kin groups and cosmologies in the off-screen production of work as a source of authentication to the truth value of the final product, as well as the extension and maintenance of taboos on circulating images of the dead that restricted the circulation of certain works. As Indigenous media productions have developed under these regimes, the works made for such purposes increasingly circulates beyond the moment of broadcast to other Native communities through the circulation of tapes, films, DVDs, and internet portals, as well as to non-Aboriginal audiences via regional, national, and even international television. The capacity of this work to have a life after television, so to speak, helps overcome the potential isolation of Indigenous media to particular channels or programming. More broadly, the telling and circulation of these stories and histories through media forms that can circulate beyond the local has been an important force for constituting claims for land and cultural rights and for developing alliances with other communities. So some have argued that the development of television across the Arctic in Canada was foundational to developing the political voice that helped push for the formation of Nunavut, the first indigenously governed territory in Canada in 1999. Getting Indigenous histories onto mainstream media, as Indigenous units situated in national broadcasters have done, has been a critical goal everywhere, as Aboriginal citizens feel their contributions to national narratives have largely been erased. As a case in point, the 2008 broadcast in Australia of the 7-part Indigenously directed series, The First Australians, was widely regarded as a major breakthrough, offering a compelling counter-narrative of the nation's history from an Indigenous point of view, from the pre-contact era to the present. In addition to its paradigm-changing effect on the Australian public sphere, the series also demonstrated the productivity of colonial archival film and photography when it has been appropriated and taken up and re-signified by Indigenous media makers as visible evidence of their experiences rather than of the colonial project.